Welcome back to Can You Come Home? Last week was kind of a lot. After recording that episode, I realized how nervous I was and how there were some things that I needed to clarify for the sake of this series at large, and then more specifically, just to give some context to the story overall. And that's what I'm going to do today. Before I get going, I do want to mention, if I have not explicitly said this already, what I'm sharing here is my perspective, my viewpoint, my angle on a story that unfolded. I realize there are multiple perspectives. There are other sides to this story. I am presenting mine. The other thing I wanted to mention that is, if I do not have the express permission from any of the characters in this story to use their first name, I'm not using their real first name. Some of the names of the characters going forward are going to be fictitious names because I don't have express permission to use their name. Okay, let's get into the bulk of this week's episode. I want to cast a light and clarify some things that you may have picked up on that I mentioned and referenced in the last episode that might have you a little bit confused. Specifically, I referenced a difficult childhood, a music career, and losing my family of origin. And I want to briefly put those events in their proper context so it makes sense when I reference them again going forward. These are some pretty major pillars of my life, and they are all going to come back into play in later episodes. My childhood home was dysfunctional. It was unhealthy. There were parts of it that were very dark, and no one knew. It was the kind of thing that behind closed doors, the culture of my family was one way, but outward facing, almost because we all knew how weird it was behind closed doors, we put on somewhat of a facade to make it seem like we were more normal than we were. The culture of my home was very fundamentalist. I had a very overbearing, strict dad with a mother who was complicit in his actions. There was a lot of toxicity, there was abuse, there was a lot of walking on eggshells, hypervigilance. The tone of the overall family dynamic was set by the emotional condition or state of my dad. So if he was in a good mood, there was laughter in the house. And if he was not in a good mood, it was kind of like hunker down and make yourself safe. This entire time in my childhood home, I possessed this quiet internal knowing that something was wrong, but not really having the capabilities to figure out what to do about it. It never occurred to me to say something to someone. And it was the kind of thing that even if I had tried to describe what was going on, it was easy to explain it away as, well, that's just the way your parents want to do things. Or it was just close enough to okay that I'm not sure I would have been believed. I didn't know what to do with the reality that I knew something was wrong inside my family. So I tucked it away. Didn't spend a lot of time consciously thinking about that. And it really wasn't until I was older and out of the house that I began to see clearly the kind of wrong that was going on and the insidious slipperiness of that wrong that made it really difficult to nail down and even label. Even to this day, I have a hard time accurately describing what was going on, other than it was just dark and toxic and difficult to live in. So there I was, living in this darkness behind closed doors, tucking it away. And the way that I coped with that was my creativity. My creative outlets included music, singing, songwriting, playing the piano, journaling, eventually learning to play the guitar. That was the realm in which I expressed myself creatively from a very young age, and then throughout all of my high school, college, young adult years. These musical gifts and abilities were planted inside of me from birth. I took a few lessons, but that's not why I possessed musical ability. I just sort of had it in me. I've always had it in me. I don't remember never not having it in me. So it was just something that was inside of me. And I got a lot of accolades from these gifts. I was labeled as kind of the golden child of my family. I was labeled as talented, gifted. My dad called me anointed in a very spiritual context, that I was set apart, destined for something different and great because of these musical giftings. I used my creativity as an outlet for a lot of big feelings. My feelings were always big. They were always right below the surface. And when they came up, I used music as a way to take those feelings and turn them into a finished product. I think I was dealing with the tucked away darkness that I didn't know what to do with and creating something tangible out of it. Music became one of the things that could keep me safe. It was a way that I could gain approval, a way that I could kind of lose myself. I could feel the warm glow of approval and love when I played and sang, and that's a really safe feeling when everything else feels unsafe. I took this love of expressing myself through music, of my ability to play the guitar and sing. I took that all with me when I went to college at TCU in Fort Worth. Those skills were very well received. I developed a very successful music career, started playing in coffee houses. I started leading worship gatherings for different organizations and eventually went on staff with the largest Bible church in town. They hired me to start their inaugural acoustic worship service and to lead worship for that service as a college student. It was the launch pad for my music career. I went from being kind of someone that would play for a handful of people to filling rooms with hundreds of people. I wrote all my own songs, I performed them, I released a CD in 1997, and when I graduated from college, my full-time job was traveling and singing. This was my entire way of life. I supported myself financially with it. I was pursuing bigger and better things in Nashville. I was hopeful to get signed by a record label. This is what I wanted to do with my life. I came to life on stage in very unique ways, and the ability to take my feelings, turn them into a song, and then perform that song in front of a crowd was very connective. There was a particular sector of the population for whom my music was very transformative. Some of my songs were played on Christian radio. I still occasionally receive emails from people thanking me for my songs and telling me the impact that they have had on their lives. There was something really, really special about that time in my life. It was because of my music career that I met him. I was hired as the musical guest for a ski trip that he was planning for the para-church organization for whom he worked at the time, and that is how we met. Fast forward a few years after that, when we were ready to get married, my family of origin did not approve. This was not a huge surprise in hindsight, but it was shocking and unexplainable in the moment. There's a whole story behind this. It's when the light started to get flipped on for me about how different, dark, and unhealthy my family of origin really was. The farther I got away from them, the more the light came on, and then something about my decision to get married really flipped the light all the way on, and I could see the dysfunction for what it was. They gave me an ultimatum. I could either tell him no and move back home and keep my relationship with my family, or I could marry him and I would not have a relationship with them going forward. Given the level of darkness that I had experienced, and given all that I was seeing clearly for the first time, I chose to follow my heart and marry the man I loved at the expense and at the loss of my family of origin. They did not come to the wedding. They cut off all relationship with me. Anyone who was in that season of life with me would agree when I say that getting married at the time was the right decision. All green lights pointed to this being the right decision. In hindsight, I know that I made the right decision at the time. There were a lot of people who were speaking into both of our lives at the time, who we loved and trusted and who knew us intimately and deeply and wanted our greatest good, who looked at both of us and said, "You're doing the right thing." There wasn't a single, apart from my family, there was not a single person who said, "I think you're really making a mistake." Having to pay the price of losing my family was horrible, but to me, it felt like the only way forward. Being asked to choose between staying in this dark place or following my heart, it didn't even feel like the choice. And the fact that that was the choice I was given was indicative of how unhealthy things were. So I got married, I lost my family of origin, and what I didn't expect to happen, I lost my music career. The wound that I suffered at the loss and abandonment from my family was so profound that I couldn't sing. I couldn't write. I could not begin to process the feelings that I had because they knocked me over. They were so massive and so wounding that even glancing at them was more than I could handle. So the idea of assimilating those somehow and creating art out of it and then performing that art in front of an audience wasn't possible for me. And I let it die. Almost overnight, I lost everything that I had built in my music career. Now, this new wound that I had, this new abandonment wound from the loss of my family, created in me an instant desire to gather people around me. All I wanted to do was figure out a way to get people into my home so that I felt like I had a family. I knew that I didn't have a real family, but I thought that maybe I could patchwork together a sense of belonging that would feel close to a family. And if I needed to be the one to set the table and cook the meal and invite people over in order for that to happen, then I was going to initiate that. So I did. I put my whole heart and all of my effort into getting really good at this. And it turns out I actually enjoyed it. I tapped into like a love of the domestic arts that I did not even know existed. And I went all in. I spent the better part of a decade getting really good at this particular skill set, and it worked. I loved having people over. I loved creating a sense of family and belonging. I loved hosting. I loved creating home and cooking and all the things that go with that. In the same way that I would feel parts of myself come alive when I sang on stage, I really felt parts of myself come alive when I would prepare a meal or have people over or get my house ready. There was something bubbling inside of me that wasn't just a coping mechanism. It really was like I discovered a new creative outlet that I never would have known existed had it not been for the situation. Along the way, I had 4 children in the span of 6 years, which is a lot of children in a short amount of time. And in addition to tending to the house and all the stuff, I now had 4 small humans that I stayed home with. I love my children. I love creating home for them. Being a full-time stay-at-home mom was really, really ill-suited to my specific personality type and what fills my cup. And it was really difficult. And I say really difficult in a way that like, yeah, that work is difficult for people who enjoy that kind of work. It was tremendously difficult for me as someone not really in love with that kind of work. I honestly did not know that there was another path for me. I was operating under the wrong assumption that if I had children, that my job was to stay home with them. I know how asinine that sounds right now, but at the time I really didn't know there was another way. And I wish someone would have told me, there's another way, you know. I probably would have been a better version of myself if I had found a way to work outside the home, but I didn't. I stayed, and I somehow dug deep and found the ability to just keep doing it, to just keep going. I think that kind of gumption and that kind of digging deep comes from a pattern of living with behind closed doors darkness and just figuring out a way to keep going even when it doesn't seem like you can keep going. That's a pattern in my life, and I applied it when I was at home for the better part of a decade with my kids. I would say I was living, but I wasn't alive. Along the way, my marriage had turned pretty sour for reasons that at the time I couldn't put my finger on. Obviously now I know what was going on, but at the time it just kept getting worse and worse. Having a marriage turn sour on its own is terrible. But the added layer of having left my family of origin, watched my music career die for the sake of marrying this man, not to mention I didn't have a family to fall back on. I didn't have a safe place to go. I didn't have a support network that most people have. It felt like all of my eggs were in the marriage basket, and it did not seem tenable to even imagine leaving. But the marriage was unhealthy. And just like my family of origin, my marriage was terrible behind closed doors. In front of everyone else, it looked normal, perfect, healthy. And it was the kind of wrong that, again, I couldn't quite put into words. If someone had asked me and I would have described what was going on, it easily would have been categorized as, well, you know, marriage is hard. Sounds like you're just having a tough season. And yet, I knew in that quiet, deep inner knowing place that this is the kind of wrong that isn't just marriage is hard kind of challenge. This is the kind of wrong that feels like the kind of wrong from my childhood home. It was incredibly frustrating not to be able to wrap my hands or my words or my head around the kind of wrong in a way that I could have presented to someone and asked for help. As my children grew, as our home grew, as I continued to put one foot in front of the other, this skill set centered around hospitality and the thoughts and ideas and transformative power behind it really, really took hold in my heart. I got so good at it and became so impassioned about it that I built a business around it. And I once again saw a part of myself come to life. Yes, the business allowed me to tap into this skill set of cooking and creating home and running a business. It also allowed me an escape from the terrible things that were happening behind closed doors. It allowed a place for parts of my creativity to come to life. It allowed me to get out of my house. It allowed me to interact with other adults. In some ways, building and working at Hurley House felt parallel to the way that I felt when I left my childhood home and went to college. I got out of that dysfunctional home and had a place, a literal physical place with a community and activities, a platform for me to use what I was good at in ways that I never had before. And that's what happened inside Hurley House. I got to get out of my dark home and into this place that was full of literal and metaphorical light. It was beautiful. It was an expression of my heart. And it was a job. And it was something that I could leave my house and be gone and work at. And it gave me something to focus on and do. And I loved it. I loved everything about building that business. So that's the context for my difficult childhood, my music career, losing my family of origin, and a little bit more about the business that I built. And that gets us caught back up to where we were when we ended last week. Now it's time to drop back into that first weekend after I heard the terrible news.